The desert held secrets that night, but nothing was more cutting than her voice. Please, don't take the cloth off. It was a desperate request, a plea that silenced even the wind. And before you find out what Jack Callahan saw when he stopped his truck on that dark road, subscribe to the channel here, because the story you're about to hear now isn't just about pain or fear, ... It's about courage, love, and a destiny that can change in seconds. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story will touch hearts around the world. The dust from the road rose like a veil as her voice cut through the night. Please, don't take the cloth off. If you've just arrived, take a deep breath and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything from this story that will move you. Write in the comments what city and country you're watching from, because I want to feel how far this journey reaches. The black pickup truck of Jack Callahan, the millionaire cowboy from Arizona, groaned as it screeched to a halt in front of the trembling figure. The AM radio blared an old song, as if the past insisted on returning. On the dashboard, the clock that had stopped since 1997 reminded us that some hearts are also stuck in time. And on the dust-covered hood, the reflection of two fates about to collide shone like an omen. She was barefoot, wrapped in a white cloth that no longer protected her from the cold or her shame. Her knees were crusted with dried blood and dust, and her eyes were begging for something she couldn't even name. The wind smelled of wet earth and gasoline, swirling between barbed wire and silent mandragoras. Jack descended with measured steps, boots squeaking, the heavy buckle on his belt clanging like a warning bell. I will help you, he said softly, and the phrase came out with a taste of iron, ancient and indisputable. His calloused hand trembled less than his soul, accustomed to million-dollar deals and expensive silences. But there, faced with her request, all the money in the world seemed worthless. He touched her shoulder with his leather coat, the scent of smoke and old lavender escaping the fabric. The skin beneath the cloth had the feverish heat of someone who had run away for too long and too far. In the darkness, a coyote howled distantly, and the radio crackled, as if someone were stuttering on the other end. The ranch's landline phone, hanging on the kitchen wall, looked like a mute mouth waiting for bad news. Jack realized that this wasn't the first night the road had brought ghosts, but it was the first time a ghost had a pulse. Tears and courage to ask. He opened the truck door and placed her on the bench, like someone carrying a vow to the altar. Upon arriving at the ranch, the porch light blinked twice before steadying. An old house electrical superstition. The F-250's engine idled slowly, spitting heat, and the smell of diesel mixed with the coffee warming on the stove. The dusty portrait of his dead wife stared across the room, reminding Jack of what loss does to a man. The battery-powered radio on the shelf hissed, picking up a frequency from truckers on us -60. Between codes and laughter, a phrase, wanted, a bruised woman, white cloth, pays well. Jack swallowed hard, feeling that the night had eyes and a wallet, and that fortune sometimes buys silence, but never extinguishes screams. He led the stranger to the guest room, the wooden floor creaking secretly beneath his boots. The window rattled in the wind, and each knock seemed like a warning to close my heart again. The yellow lamp shed a bee-like light on the white cloth, revealing spots that were not dust. Her fingers gripped the fabric like someone gripping the edge of a cliff. Please, she whispered, and the word trembled like a guitar string in a roadhouse. Jack felt the weight of the request, but also the shadow of danger looming over the roof. There were roads he knew with his eyes closed. This one was made of scars. He took a deep breath and pulled the cloth away, a simple gesture that split the world into before and after. The marks appeared as burned maps, twisted symbols, letters that didn't belong on any skin. The smell of cheap ointment and old metal wafted up. bringing back memories of hospital and fire. Jack's hands trembled, not from what he saw, but from what he understood. Someone had signed her pain. Outside, the distant gallop of a horse mingled with the hum of streetlights. Some distant radio tried to play Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, but choked on static dot, and Jack wished for a second that it was just a bad night. He got a clean sheet, warm. Water spoke softly, as if the words could break her. "My name is Jack Callahan. You're safe here." Security, however, sounded like a promise made under stormy skies. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she looked like a child hiding in a wardrobe. The wind brought the smell of rain, and with it, a thread of hope that hurt, because it was so fragile. In the hallway, the phone rang once and stopped, just to prove he knew the right number. The silence that followed was heavier than any answer. The wall clock started ticking on its own again, ticking like footsteps on the floor. Jack dropped his brick cell phone on the sideboard, the green screen blinking with no signal. The small safe behind the fireplace mantel held papers that could buy a city. But what the house needed at that moment was not money. It was faith. He wet a cloth and pressed it against the marked skin, and she gasped as if coming back to the surface. Their eyes met for a second that lasted a lifetime, and something ancient, something Jack had sworn was dead, breathed again. Outside, the gate chain rattled, metal against metal, with no one around. The irrigation trestles vibrated like thin bones in the wind. A distant headlight crossed the hill, then went out like a spy remembering its existence. Jack blew out the stove flame and left only the embers so that the house would have a discreet heart. He pulled the coat over her shoulders and felt a shiver that didn't come from the cold. Without knowing why, he thought about learning to sweep the porch again, and how certain promises are born when we no longer have an excuse to run away. She tried to speak a name, but her voice broke in the middle, like a broken bridge over a deep river. Ellie. It finally came out, a torn petal carrying a storm. Jack repeated quietly for the universe to memorize. Ellie. The sound of the echo itself seemed to sign an invisible contract between the two. The house nodded with a creak of wood, the entire ranch paying attention. From afar, thunder responded, reminding us that the desert also knows how to cry. And his heart, old and rich, discovered that it could still be poor and brave. In the darkness of the room, Ellie gripped his hand with surprising strength, an anchor calling for shore. Jack realized that the greatest fortune is having someone to fight. For when the world closes its account, the radio crackled again. But this time it sounded like a warning, not music. In the distance, dogs barked in a chain, and the cows stirred like a nervous audience. The night bit the horizon with metal teeth and broken promises. Jack felt on his skin that the road was sending a message through the dust. He believed the tragedy was in the past, but that night proved otherwise. The ranch breathed like an ancient organism, every board creaking with stories no one dared tell. Jack pushed open the door with his shoulder, carrying Ellie as if she were made of glass about to shatter. The smell of stale coffee burning in. The wood stove mingled with the scent of wet leather wafting from his coat. The wind cut through the cracks in the windows, whistling like a child lost in the desert. Ellie, huddled under the cloth, watched everything with the eyes of a cornered deer, absorbing every sound as if each crack were a threat. Jack noticed and walked slowly, each step measured so as not to frighten her further. He settled her in. A wooden chair near the fireplace with a timid flame crackled. The flame didn't just warm the air, it warmed the suffocating silence that threatened to engulf them both. Jack lit the lantern on the table, and for an instant, the golden light revealed the delicacy of her features, hidden beneath the dirt and fear. Ellie clutched his coat as if it were a shield against the world. Her eyes roamed the walls, the paintings, the rifle propped in the corner, as if mapping escape routes. Jack said nothing, just let the space between them speak for itself. Outside, the distant lowing of cattle echoed along with the creak of the windswept fence. Ellie shivered, and Jack instinctively lit more wood in the stove to create a sound that drowned out the world. The house began to breathe again, with the rhythm of the flame, with the smell of burning wood. Jack knew this was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that could break someone. He poured a mug of strong black coffee, but didn't offer it. He just held it between his calloused hands, letting the steam fill the air. Ellie didn't speak, but her eyes screamed stories. Jack didn't want to hear yet. Every time the wind blew against the window frames, she flinched as if expecting broken doors and cruel voices. Jack watched her from afar, unhurried, having learned in life that trust isn't born with words, but with presence. The living room walls held old portraits and dusty rodeo awards. This ranch was a museum of his own loneliness. But now, for the first time in years, there was another breath besides his own echoing within. The hours ticked by slowly, marked only by the ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall. The landline phone, motionless, seemed to mock the tranquility, as if waiting for the exact moment to ring. Ellie, still clutching the white cloth, breathed rapidly, as if fighting against memories that returned in waves. Jack realized that speaking at that moment would be like throwing stones into a frozen lake. It might crack everything. He preferred silence, the chair creaking under his weight, his eyes fixed on the embers. The rancher knew that sometimes the greatest gesture is not to intrude on another's pain. That's when a thread of a voice emerged, fragile and trembling, almost lost in the sound of the wind. "Water," she said, and the words seemed to have crossed entire deserts to reach her. Jack stood slowly, without a creak, as if every movement could be interpreted as a threat. He picked up the glass pitcher from the counter, filled a mug, and approached with light steps. He handed her the water without a word, but with a look that said, "You're safe." Ellie accepted it, her hands trembling, but drank as if for the first time in days. The sound of water running down her throat was the most human that had echoed on that ranch in years. Jack looked away, respecting the vulnerability he witnessed. Ellie, for a moment, met his eyes over the rim of her mug. There was no explicit gratitude, no plea for help. There was only a silent confession, "I'm still here." Jack felt his throat dry, not from the strong coffee he still held, but from the recognition of a truth. Sometimes survival is the greatest form of courage. Deep in the house, the radio crackled, trying to pick up a lost frequency. A metallic voice announced disappearances, rewards, and Jack noticed Ellie react with a subtle shudder. The information wasn't clear, but enough for him to understand that her presence wasn't an accident. She hadn't stumbled onto the road by chance. There were stories behind that fabric, stories that dragged enemies, dirty money, and violence. The rancher felt his spine tingle, but he stood firm, because weakness had no place in that moment. Ellie gently placed her mug on the table, as if finishing a prayer. The fire in the fireplace reflected in her eyes, giving the impression that there was still life there, even if hidden beneath layers of pain. Jack noticed that the way she clutched his coat was no longer just fear. It was also a need to belong. And that, somehow, resonated with him. The man who had sworn never to be tied to anyone again began to realize that this wasn't a simple choice. He was faced with a calling. The wind died for a moment, creating an almost sacred silence. Jack took a deep breath and realized that that simple request for water had opened a door impossible to close. He wasn't sure what Ellie was carrying, nor who she was fighting, but he already felt he was marked. That moment, that night, that shared glance over the rim of a mug would be remembered forever. Jack didn't know it, but that simple request would start a war he couldn't avoid. The morning dawned with a shy sun, tinging the ranch with gold and dust. Jack left early to chop wood, but he noticed Ellie sitting on the porch steps, his coat still around her shoulders. She wasn't looking at him, staring at the horizon as if searching for a path that no longer existed. The silence was thick, but not as heavy as the night before. It was a silence that seemed to invite choked-up truths to come out. Jack lit a cigarette and stood, respecting her space. Then, almost in a whisper, Ellie broke the air. "They made me clean their boots." Jack stood still, the cigarette forgotten between his fingers, the smoke rising slowly. Her voice seemed to come from far away, heavy with weariness and memories. That shouldn't be remembered. It wasn't a ranch. It was a mining camp, a place that doesn't appear on any map. Her gaze was lost, as if she saw the scenes before her eyes. Men and women were taken there, promised payment. But what they gave was pain. Jack clenched his fists without realizing it, feeling anger rise along with compassion. The wind carried. The smell of dry earth mixed with rust, as if the desert witnessed every word. Ellie continued, firmer now, though her lips trembled. "When I tried to run away the first time, they broke my nose." They laughed as the blood fell into the dust. Jack closed his eyes, and the memory of the wife he had lost came to him. The feeling of helplessness that had haunted him ever since. That woman, scarred and wounded, reignited not only his desire to protect, but also his fury against men who used power to destroy lives. The battery-powered radio inside the house crackled, trying to bring news from around the world. But Jack could only hear her confession. Ellie lifted the hem of her coat, revealing the design burned into her back. The second time they did it, they said it would be, so she'd never forget who was in charge. Her voice faltered, but not her. Gaze, there was pride hidden in the pain, as if just being alive was a victory in itself. Jack swallowed hard, his hands shaking, but he remained silent. He knew this was her moment. His heart pounded in time with memories that weren't his. Ellie's. Every word was a dagger thrust into injustice. "I only got out because one of them let me escape. But it wasn't kindness. He bet I wouldn't make it to town alive." Jack crushed his cigarette on the porch floor, the bitter taste rising in his mouth. The millionaire rancher, owner of land and cattle, felt like the most useless man in the world, in the face of the cruelty he'd heard. And at the same time, a silent promise arose within him. No one would touch her like that again. The sun rose higher, illuminating the marks on her face. Ellie took a deep breath, and for the first time, looked Jack in the eye without looking away. "I ran until I couldn't feel my legs. I slept on the ground, ate roots, drank puddled water. But I got here. I don't know why. I just know I had to come." Jack gripped the porch railing tightly, the wood creaking under the pressure. He realized there was more to this escape than survival. It was destiny, written in dust and blood. And now it was part of his life. Ellie's eyes returned to the road, and her expression changed. It wasn't just pain. It was alert. Her eyes widened, as if hearing something Jack hadn't yet noticed. The desert silence, so heavy seconds before, was broken by a distant sound. A sound approaching. The rancher removed his hat, tilted his head, and listened too. His heart raced, hooves pounding against the earth, kicking up dust at the bend in the road. Jack could recognize horses, coming at a hunting pace. The wind carried. The smell of leather and sweat from approaching animals. Ellie clutched her coat and cringed, her eyes welling up, as if recognizing the footsteps of monsters from the past. Jack didn't need to ask. He knew danger had found its way to his door. The rancher took a deep breath, dropped his cigarette from his pocket, and walked to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The morning heat seemed to boil against his skin. And deep down, he felt the time for silence was ending. Ellie whispered only one sentence, nearly swallowed by the wind. "They found me." Jack looked at her, saw the truth in her trembling gaze, and said nothing. He simply drew the gun to his arms, like an ancient ritual. The ranch, which until minutes before had breathed memories and confessions, now pulsed like a battlefield. The sound of hooves echoed louder, turning each second into eternity. Jack knew the tone of that story had just changed. The horizon trembled with the rising dust. The porch seemed too small to contain the tension. Ellie wept silently, but it wasn't pure fear. There was also the courage of someone who had faced hell. Jack adjusted his hat and felt the blood pounding in his ears. Anger, compassion, and the need to protect mingled within him like gunpowder ready to ignite. And then, when the sound of the horses became as clear as thunder, he realized destiny had knocked on his door. Dust rose like a curtain in front of the gate, and the sound of hooves gave way to the creaking of a horse standing firm in the yard. Jack narrowed his eyes, leaning against the porch, a heavy rifle resting on his arm. A man who dismounted was no ordinary farmhand. He wore an expensively made vest, a loose tie, shiny boots, a starched mustache, and a mocking smile that didn't suit the desert. He walked with practiced calm, as if treading territory he believes he owns. Ellie, behind. Jack stifled a sob. The stranger raised his voice, firm as a knife. Ellie rose. "You shouldn't have left. It's time to go back." His heart froze as he heard the full name echoing across the hills. Jack felt Ellie's body shrink against the wall, like a cornered animal. He didn't look back, but her silence spoke volumes. The farmer cleared his throat, spat on the dry ground, and raised his rifle, bracing it casually against his shoulder. The scene smelled of gunpowder, even before the first shot rang out. "She's not going anywhere," Jack replied, his voice deep and unhurried, as if each syllable were a brick standing between her and danger. The man laughed, a short, dirty laugh, as out of place as the dusty suit he wore. "It's none of your business, old man. This is her business, and the business of the men who rule this valley. You don't know who you're messing with." Jack didn't blink. His silence weighed more heavily than any answer. The villain straightened his tie and tilted his hat, trying to assert superiority, but each gesture was a mask for the venom in his voice. Ellie whispered something Jack didn't understand, but the word fear was etched in her eyes. Jack stepped forward. His rifle pointed slightly at the ground, but ready. "The road is long, and your face is not welcome on it. Take that horse and get lost before I decide to pull the trigger." The villain narrowed his eyes, but didn't back down immediately. He pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped it across his face, feigning indifference. "You think a lost rancher and an old shotgun are going to stop the likes of us? This isn't about honor. It's about money." His voice sounded like knives scraping stone, and every word was aimed more at Ellie than at Jack. Ellie cried silently, hidden behind the doorframe, but Jack could feel her weight in the air, her heart pounding. He steadied his rifle and spat on the ground again. "I have money. You can't buy a soul." Silence fell heavily, only the wind tugging at the dry leaves in the yard. The villain sighed, feigning weariness, and climbed back onto his horse. With practiced elegance. "So it's going to be like this, cowboy. Protect what can't be protected. Let's see how long it lasts." The reins snapped, and the horse turned toward the road. Jack followed every movement, his finger firm on the trigger, his eyes cold as steel. The man smirked as he walked away, spitting into the dust as if sealing a promise. Ellie trembled, clinging to Jack's coat, her lips colorless, her eyes fixed on the dissipating dust. The rancher took a deep breath, lowered his rifle, and only then looked at her. "He won't be back anytime soon. he lied, knowing he had just opened a door that wouldn't close easily. His heart throbbed in alarm, like a bell tolled by ancient. Ghosts. Ellie approached slowly, still cowering, her eyes brimming with tears, demanding explanations Jack couldn't provide. He ran a hand over his forehead, wiping away the cold sweat. The millionaire rancher, accustomed to trading cattle and signing contracts worth more than entire ranches, now faced a threat beyond measure. No dollar amount could compensate for the coming war. The only certainty was the need to protect her, not just for her pain, but for what he felt welling up in his chest, something that had gone nameless for many years. Inside the house, the radio crackled, shattering the silence. With fragmented news, scattered words echoed: disappearance, reward, group of miners. Jack turned off the radio with a sharp punch, the static echo still vibrating off the walls. Ellie looked up at him and murmured, "They always come back. They never stop at the first threat." Her voice held the bitter certainty of someone who had lived through this cycle. Jack nodded, swallowing the anger that rose like acid. He knew this time would be no different. He leaned the rifle against the doorframe and pulled Ellie by the hand, firm but careful. "You won't be taken back here. I promise you that." The words came out like a war oath, echoing through the ranch, like a shot yet unfired. Ellie closed her eyes and let herself be guided, but the tremor in her hands betrayed that the man's shadow still loomed over her. The wind kicked up dust on the road, as if carrying the trail of the threat left behind. Jack knew that every grain of sand carried with it the reminder that the danger was far from over. On the horizon, the horseman turned his head for the last time. The setting sun tinted his face red, and the crooked smile revealed the truth. This wasn't a retreat, but a calculated retreat. He departed slowly, but his gaze remained fixed like a knife on Jack's back. The rancher felt a shiver run down his spine, a clear warning that the night would bring more than silence. Ellie leaned her head against the porch wall, breathing deeply, trying to believe the promise she'd heard. But deep down, they both knew, the way he looked back, it was a promise to return. The following days dragged on, tinged with the sound of the wind and the creaking of the ranch's ancient doors. The first dawn after the confrontation brought a strange calm, as if time were holding its breath. Ellie walked slowly around the kitchen, still hunched over, but already offering small helping hands, wiping the table with a damp cloth, organizing chipped dishes, sweeping a corner or two. Jack, accustomed to the silence of an empty house, was surprised to see her stirring. The kettle making weak but careful coffee. That scene, simple and banal, had the power to stir something deep he'd thought dead. Jack, for his part, began to break his own habits of solitude. For the first time in years, he picked up the old broom leaning against the porch and swept away the accumulated dust. The sound of the bristles dragging on the wooden floor mingled with the timid song of a bird on the post. Ellie watched from inside, holding a mug of water, and for a moment, a barely perceptible smile crossed her lips. It was as if the forgotten routine of a home was beginning to emerge there, amid careful steps and gestures that required no words. The farmer noticed this, but didn't comment. He treasured the moment like one who keeps gold in his pocket. At night, they sat at the lantern-lit table. Jack spoke little, but listened a lot. Ellie, still uncertain, shared fragments of her life, often interrupted by silence, laden with bad memories. "They laughed when we cried," she said once, picking at her plate without eating. Jack felt his stomach churn, remembering his own pain, the fire that had taken his wife, the pent-up scream he could never release. Two different worlds, but stitched together by the same scar of loss. It was this invisible wound that, somehow, brought them together. The days passed, and the ranch seemed to breathe new life. Ellie hung dried flowers in the window, as if to add color to the desert. Jack fixed the broken fence in the backyard, something he'd avoided for years. With each small gesture, a spark of trust emerged, still fragile, but enough to illuminate the shadows surrounding them. Ellie still had nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, sweaty, her eyes lost. At those times, Jack would remain silent at the bedroom door until she calmed down. He never crossed the line, never invaded her space, but being there was his way of saying, "You are not alone." There were, however, moments when the silence revealed too much. Ellie, staring out the window, always seemed to be waiting for someone, as if she knew the enemy wouldn't give up easily. Jack noticed and pretended not to notice, but inside, anger grew. He was a businessman, accustomed to handling contracts and fortunes, but he'd never known how to deal with the feeling of helplessness. Now, with each frightened look from her, he felt a different calling, not to save, but to share the burden of pain. And that decision began to change the way he saw his own life. One afternoon, Ellie found him sitting on the porch, cleaning an old photo. It was of his wife, in a blue dress, her eternal smile trapped in yellowed paper. Jack didn't try to hide. She was lost in a fire, and I could never forgive myself for not being there. Ellie approached slowly, her eyes full of empathy. I lost everything too, but they were still alive when they took it from me. The silence that followed was deep, like a silent pact. They didn't need to say anything else. They both knew they carried open wounds, and perhaps that was precisely what united them. On the third day, Ellie risked a quiet laugh when Jack complained about the bitter coffee she'd made. It was a fragile but real sound, cracking the armor that enveloped them both. Jack, surprised, let out a small smile, a rare thing for a man who had buried his emotions along with the past. In that moment, the ranch no longer felt like a tomb of memories, but a home trying to be reborn. And without realizing it, every little detail forged a connection between them, still nameless, but alive as the flame of the lantern, the battery-powered. Radio crackled again, bringing news of blocked roads and armed men spotted in the area. Jack firmly switched off the receiver, but Ellie noticed his gaze harden. The threat hadn't disappeared, merely lurking in the shadows. And this made the atmosphere heavy again, as if time at the ranch were a stolen respite before the storm. Even so, they both held on to these days as if they were gifts they didn't know if they would have again. Life finally seemed to offer them a thread of normalcy. Even if it was fragile as glass dot as dusk fell, the ranch grew quieter than usual. Jack went outside to check on the horses. Ellie gathered firewood near the porch. That's when he stopped, his body rigid, his eyes narrowed, toward the edge of the fence. There was something there, amid the desert shadows, something more than just wind or cattle. Figures moved discreetly, as if prowling, waiting for the right moment to act. Jack felt his heart race, instinct warning him more than his eyes could confirm. He said nothing to Ellie, just set the rifle closer to the door. That afternoon, the air seemed heavy, dust rising on its own, as if someone had walked quickly. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon, tinged with red. Ellie, unaware, hummed softly in the kitchen, trying to pretend life was normal again. But Jack knew something was stalking his land, something that hadn't come in peace. The rancher clenched his fists, anger mingling with fear, and thought the war wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right moment to knock on his door again. Dusk brought with it an eerie silence, as if even the crickets had given up singing. Jack was on the porch, his rifle resting on his lap, when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. It wasn't a single horse, but three, and each thud against. The earth shook the ranch like a war drum. Dust rose from the path toward the gate, staining the horizon bronze. Ellie emerged from the kitchen, her hands still wet from the sink, and froze at the sight. Her eyes widened, and her coat slipped from her shoulders like an abandoned shield. The first to disembark was the same man with the worn suit and the mocking smile. The villain calmly reined in, eyeing Jack as one might an animal about to be slaughtered. Beside him were two armed men, hats low, hiding cold eyes, rifles gleaming in the last light of day. The horses snorted impatiently, and the smell of animal sweat mingled with the dust that burned his throat. The wind blew hard, kicking up grains of sand that pelted Jack's face, but he didn't blink. Ellie gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I told you I'd be back, old man." The villain's voice cut through the air like a knife through leather. "And this time, I'm not leaving without it." Jack stood slowly, his rifle firmly in his hands. It wasn't just a defensive gesture. It was a silent challenge, a marking of territory. The two henchmen chuckled softly, their gazes heavy on Ellie, who shrank ever deeper. Her heart seemed to pound too loudly, and her breath came in short, almost sobs. The villain took a step forward, dust rising around his expensive boots, his gaze glinting with cruelty. Jack spat on the ground, raised his gun, and fired into the dirt, just feet from the led horse. The boom echoed like thunder in the desert, and the animal neighed, rearing furiously. The dust rose like a wall between them. The three men froze for a second, realizing the rancher wouldn't hesitate. "The next one won't go down," Jack said, his voice as firm as worn steel. The villain's expression darkened, the smile dripping from his face like rotten oil. Ellie fell to her knees behind the door, her body shaken with fright, tears flowing uncontrollably. "You don't know who you're messing with, Callahan," the villain growled, his eyes blazing with hatred. "There are big guys in this game, people you don't want to face." The henchmen stirred in their horse saddles, fingers fidgeting on the triggers. Jack didn't move, just kept his rifle aimed, his entire body vibrating with tension. The sun was disappearing behind the hills, leaving the landscape in orange and purple shadows. His breathing was heavy, but controlled. Deep inside, he knew this duel could explode at any second. Ellie wept softly, begging voicelessly for it to end. The villain took another step forward, and Jack felt his blood boil. "She's not going with you. Not today, not ever," he declared, the sound of his words echoing like a sentence. The henchmen looked at each other uncertainly, but one of their hands was already brushing against his holster. Jack raised his rifle higher, ready to fire. The silence that followed was deadly, broken only by the nervous neighing of the horses. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder, still fresh in the air, as if the earth itself awaited the next shot. The tension was so thick, it felt like a knife could cut it. Suddenly, Ellie let out a muffled scream and fell to the side, her knees buckling under the weight of fear. Jack didn't take his eyes off the men, but every fiber of his being wanted to run to her. "Get up, Ellie," he muttered through clenched teeth, his deep voice trembling with suppressed rage. The villain laughed, the laughter echoing dryly in the twilight. "Look, Callahan, you're protecting a woman who can't even stand anymore." The rancher's jaw clenched, his hand firm on the trigger. He knew he couldn't give in. Protecting Ellie wasn't just an obligation, it was a promise. The villain raised his hand, and his men moved, but they didn't draw their weapons. The scene was slow, almost theatrical. Jack held his aim, his finger itching to end it all right then and there. His heart pounded like a war drum. Ellie, still on the ground, gasped for air, her eyes begging for it to end. Jack took a deep breath and thought of his dead wife, of the fire that had stolen his past. He wouldn't let another life burn before his eyes. If he had to, he would go down shooting. And it was at that moment that something changed in the scene. A low whistle cut through the silence. coming from the tree line. The three men turned immediately, their horses stirring, as if recognizing a dangerous presence. Jack didn't lower his gun, but his heart recognized the sound even before he saw its odor. From the shadows of the woods emerged a tall man, hat low, rifle slung over his shoulder. The gleam of a badge reflected the last light of sunset. His voice was steady, like aged leather. Without needing to shout, "I would think twice before taking the next step." The villain gritted his teeth, cursing under his breath, but didn't move. Jack took a deep breath, his chest lightening for a split second. Ellie looked up and saw the clear silhouette on the road. It was Abram Heil, Jack's old war buddy, now sheriff of the territory. He walked steadily, his gaze cold and implacable, like a man who had already buried too many battles to be easily frightened. Jack clutched the rifle to his chest and knew the night was not lost. But he also understood a bitter truth. The war had just changed in size. Abram Hale's presence changed the air on the ranch. The sheriff walked calmly, but each step carried the authority of someone who had seen men fall in foxholes and no longer trembled in the face of death. The badge shone on his chest like a sentence, and his voice, firm as stone, cut through the silence. This woman is now under the protection of the law. Whoever touches her, touches me. The three men backed away slightly, the main villain trying to maintain his mocking smile, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. Ellie was breathing heavily, still on the ground, but her gaze found a spark of hope in Abram. The villain, riding high on his arrogance, slowly turned his horse and replied, "Law? Law is bought here, Sheriff. You know as well as I do that these badges are worth less than the gold that comes out of the mines." Abram didn't blink, the rifle steady in his calloused hand. Not all law is for sale, and not all men have a price. If you think the desert will hide your crimes, you're mistaken. I've seen men like you before, and they all ended up in the same hole. Jack watched the scene with his heart pounding with pride for his old friend, but also with the certainty that the war would not be easy. Ellie stood up slowly, leaning against the porch wall, still trembling. Jack ran to her and grabbed her arm, feeling the fragility of her body. The villain, chuckling softly, spat on the ground and announced, "You're up against something much bigger than you imagine. It's not just a mining camp, it's a consortium. Bigwigs, judges, mayors, businessmen, all eating from the same plate. You think you can take on this with an old ranch and a rusty badge?" The words fell like poison in the air, and Jack felt the weight of the truth. This wasn't a local dispute. It was a network that spread like a snake. Abram kept his tone firm, his hand always close to the trigger. "I've brought down empires bigger than yours, boy. And if I need to bring down another, I will, no matter how many zeros you put on a check." The villain laughed, but his men didn't follow suit. Fear etched their faces. The sunset tinted the sky red, and the scene looked like something out of an ancient painting of war and honor. Jack could tell Abram's confidence was solid, but the threat could not be ignored. The coming fight was darker than any duel with hired thugs. After a few seconds of silence, the villain retreated on his horse, the other two following suit. But before they disappeared into the dust, he turned his head and gave her a cold, almost prophetic look. "You've just signed the sentence. No one touches the gold in this valley without paying the price, and you will pay." The sound of hooves faded into the road, but the threat remained embedded in everyone's chest. Ellie sighed deeply, trying to catch her breath, but Jack noticed her look. It wasn't just fear. It was also guilt, as if she carried something she hadn't yet revealed. Inside the house, Abram dropped his hat on the table and poured coffee as if it were a war ritual. "These men don't mess around, Jack. What she brought here isn't just pain. It's gunpowder. They'll be back, and they won't be back in 3. They'll be back in 20. Jack rubbed his temples, feeling exhaustion weigh down his shoulders. Ellie remained silent, but her breathing betrayed a secret burning within. Abram looked at her firmly. "You know more than you're telling, don't you?" Her silence was stronger than any words. Jack tried to break the weight of the room. "Abram, do you really think you can buy the whole town?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "Judges, mayors, sheriffs from neighboring counties. The money from the mines fattens the pockets of many. And when gold buys silence, the people suffer in silence. These men don't fear justice because they believe they already have it." Ellie trembled, her gaze lost, as if confirming every word. Jack swallowed hard, realizing he was facing something far greater than his will to protect. It was like fighting a shadow that covered the entire horizon. Night fell heavily. The radio blaring news reports of explosions in the mountains, masked accidents, and missing workers. Abram calmly cleaned his rifle, but his eyes betrayed concern. Jack stood at the window, staring at the empty road, his mind racing. Ellie sat in a corner, hugging her knees, Jack's coat still draped over her shoulders. The fire in the fireplace illuminated half of her face, revealing silent tears. Jack approached, kneeling before her. "If there's something you haven't told her, it's now that you need to tell her. I can't protect you from what I don't know." For a moment, Ellie hesitated, her lips opening and closing as if locked against the weight of the truth. Abram looked up and unhurriedly said, "Young lady, sometimes silence is more dangerous than words. And this silence is already drawing blood." Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and finally blurted out, "I know where the records are, the ledgers, names, values, everything. Powerful men will fall if this comes to light." Jack felt his stomach turn. Abram put down his coffee mug and stared into space, as if already knowing the war had just shifted. Ellie looked up at Jack, her tear-filled eyes trembling, her hands clutching her coat. "That's why they'll never stop. It's not just about, it's about what I carry inside." Jack fell silent, feeling the weight of fate closing in around them like a trap. Abram crossed his arms, took a deep breath, and spoke softly. "So, my friend, we're not just fighting men with guns. We're fighting an empire." The ranch fell silent, only the crackle of burning wood. But in Jack's mind, a certainty grew like thunder. Their lives would never be the same again. For a few days, the ranch breathed differently. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in Jack's memory, but inside the house, small gestures began to forge a truce. Ellie helped prepare meals, tinkering with the old wood-burning stove, while Jack chopped vegetables with the dexterity of someone who'd never bothered cooking. The battery-powered radio, always crackling, suddenly managed to tune into an oldies station, and a song from the 90s filled the space. It was fragile, almost ghostly, but it brought an unexpected warmth. For the first time, Ellie hummed softly, and Jack, inadvertently, smiled. Dinner was simple. Stew and stale bread warmed in the oven. But that night, it tasted like a feast. Ellie served 2 bowls and set one before Jack. The touch of her fingers brushed his for a second, and the world seemed to stop. Her gaze rose slowly, meeting his, and lingered there, locked longer than it should have. Jack looked away first, clearing his throat, feigning focus on the dish. But inside, the sensation burned like embers, rekindling a heart she'd thought forgotten. Ellie bit her lip, trying to hide the blush that crept over her face. The next morning, Ellie brought wildflowers she'd picked from around the ranch. She placed them in a makeshift glass jar near the window. The room, previously marked by the smell of dust and rust, gained color and life. Jack watched silently, feeling that each flower was like a word she couldn't say. In response, he grabbed the old, broken chair from the living room and began repairing it. The sound of the hammer against the nails was like a compass, marking the beginning of something new. Ellie, sitting nearby, watched as if harboring a secret. The nights became less heavy. After dinner, they'd sit on the porch, listening to the radio. Oldies, trucker calls on the highway, voices lost in static. Ellie would lean her head against the wood of the chair, and Jack, even without touching, felt her closeness like a gentle weight. One night, without realizing it, their hands touched simultaneously on the armrest. The shock was small, but real. Jack didn't immediately pull his hand away. Ellie didn't either, and that shared silence said more than any sentence. Gradually, Ellie's routine expanded. She began organizing shelves, washing cloths, gathering firewood. Jack swept the porch regularly, something he hadn't done in years. The ranch felt less like an abandoned fortress and more like a home. And in his eyes, there was something that not even anger toward the consortium could erase. Ellie noticed. Every time Jack fixed something, every time he noticed a forgotten detail, she felt that, somehow, she too was being fixed. It was as if, without words, he was helping her believe again. But peace wasn't always enough to silence the scars. Ellie still woke up startled some mornings, sweat streaming down her face. Jack stood silently at the door, watching until her breathing calmed. At those times, he wanted to bridge the distance, hold her hand, promise her she'd never be hurt again. But he feared shattering the fragile balance they'd built. So he contented himself with watching, like a guardian on eternal vigil. Sometimes Ellie would open her eyes and see him there. And even without words, she knew she was protected. It was during one of these moments on the balcony that the first, still timid declaration came. Ellie looked up at the starry sky and said, "You don't know what it means to me, ... to feel like I can breathe again." Jack stared at her, his heart sinking, and replied simply, "You brought life to this place." The sentence came out deeper than he'd intended, and Ellie looked away, but a soft smile escaped. It was there, in the sway of silence, that they both understood there was more between them than just survival. The next day, Jack found Ellie tidying the living room bookshelf, cleaning out the dusty picture frames. When he picked up the portrait of his deceased wife, he was silent for a moment. Ellie, noticing, gently replaced the frame, respecting his grief. Jack felt the gesture as a silent caress. He approached and without thinking took her hand. It was firm, but not heavy. Ellie took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The touch lasted longer than either of them dared admit. It was as if their hands spoke the language their hearts kept silent. That afternoon, Ellie brought new flowers, adding even more color to the house. Jack, inspired, cleaned the abandoned barn, opening windows that had been closed for years. The light streamed in, illuminating the dust as if it were suspended in gold. They laughed together for the first time when Ellie sneezed as she stirred up the dust. The sound of that laugh, clear and brief, broke through entire layers of pain. Jack watched her, realizing he was falling in love, even if he didn't yet have the courage to admit it. Ellie, noticing his gaze, felt her legs weaken. But fate never lets healing come without a price. The ranch seemed to gain color, life, and love, but beneath the surface, the threat had not disappeared. The consortium still breathed hatred. They, enemies, still waited. That night, as Ellie placed the flowers in the vase and Jack lit the lamp, the wind brought a strange chill. A draft crossed the ranch, extinguishing the flame for a moment. Jack looked up, his heart heavy, because he knew the truth that silence screamed. But every healing invites a new wound, and they hadn't seen the worst yet. The night seemed too calm. The radio blared an old song, and Ellie smiled shyly as she arranged the flowers in the window vase. Jack sat on the porch, sharpening the blade of a knife like someone performing a war ritual. The wind carried the smell of dust, and the ranch dogs began to bark in unison. The rancher looked up and saw silhouettes on the horizon. They weren't 3 men as before. There were many. Horses, old pickup trucks, headlights cutting through the darkness, rifles gleaming in the moonlight. Jack's heart raced, and his hand went to his rifle. He knew hell had come to his door. The ambush began with the dry crack of a gunshot that pierced the night. The glass in the kitchen window shattered, and Ellie fell to the ground, covering her head. Jack dove behind the doorframe, firing into the darkness. The entire ranch vibrated with the sound of bullets striking wood and shingles. The sound of the men's screams outside mingled with the desperate neighs of the horses. The cabin seemed too small to contain so much violence, each shot tearing splinters from the walls that held its history. The rancher felt his chest burn, not with fear, but with rage at seeing his home invaded by hatred. Ellie crawled to the table, eyes wide, body trembling. Jack yelled at her to stay down, but he knew danger was everywhere. The men prowled like wolves, firing through the cracks, laughing as if they'd already won. One of them threw a torch toward the barn, and the flames began to grow, illuminating the night with a cruel red. Jack fired back, hitting one of the attackers, who fell with a scream. But there were too many, and with every minute, more shots ripped through the wood of the cabin, sending up splinters and dust. The villain emerged from the confusion, wearing a dark suit and a maddened grin, like a war maestro. "You should have handed it over, Callahan," he shouted, his voice echoing like thunder. "Now you'll lose everything. The house, the cattle, the woman, everything." Jack felt his blood boil, racing toward his shadow, but the man took cover behind his henchman. Ellie saw him laughing, and something broke inside her. It wasn't just fear. It was rage. She realized that if she remained hidden, they would both die. It was time to stand up with desperate courage. Ellie ran to the wood stove and pulled out a gallon of kerosene. Jack's eyes widened when he saw what she was doing. "Ellie, no." She screamed, but she had already spilled some of the liquid near the entrance, creating a makeshift barrier. She lit a match with trembling hands and threw it to the ground. A tongue of flame shot up, illuminating the door and forcing the men to retreat. The villain took a few steps back, surprised by her audacity. "You think you can face me, girl?" Ellie lifted her chin, her gaze burning. "I have no choice. I face you or I die." Jack ran to her, holding her hand, and together they held the line of defense. The fire roared. The men shouted outside, but there was something different about that flame. It was more than fuel. It was a warning. Ellie trembled, but she didn't back down. Jack felt a quiet pride, and for the first time, he saw in her not just a survivor, but a warrior. The villain gritted his teeth, realizing that fear wouldn't be enough to defeat them. Then he shouted, "You don't understand? I'm not alone. Behind me is an entire network. Banks, judges, politicians. No one can break this." The words sank like lead into Jack's heart. He realized in that instant that the fight wasn't just against henchmen or an arrogant villain. It was against an invisible empire fueled by gold and blood. Abram, somewhere, might be able to help them, but even the law seemed small in the face of this revelation. Ellie looked at Jack, her eyes filled with tears, but also with resolve. If they have power, we have the truth, and that scares them more than any weapon. Jack squeezed her hand, and in that grip was a vow to continue, no matter the cost. The gunfire continued for minutes that felt like hours. Smoke filled the room, and each shot ripped off a chunk of the house. Jack's breath hitched but he didn't back down. Ellie, though frightened, remained beside him, passing ammunition, holding the torch like a weapon. The villain, shielded by his men, shouted orders, but his confidence was no longer what it once was. The ranch held, and this was something he hadn't expected. "You're going down, Callahan. All the love in the world won't save you," he yelled, but his own voice seemed less firm. When the sound of hooves finally began to fade, Jack took a deep breath, leaning against the broken doorframe. Silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of a partial victory, of a battle that doesn't end the war. Ellie fell into his arms, crying, her body exhausted, but her heart still pounding. The ranch was in ruins, the barn burning in the distance, and the smell of smoke permeated the air. Jack caressed her face and whispered, "You saved me." And she, her voice breaking, replied, "We saved each other." Outside, dust still danced beneath the moon, mingling with the blood staining the dry earth. Jack looked to the horizon and knew this was only the beginning. There was much more behind it, an enemy that could not be defeated with a single rifle. Ellie held his hand tightly, and in that gesture there was more courage than in all the shots. Fired, the ranch might have survived the night, but the war had merely changed shape. That night, blood fell upon the dry earth. But the war was only just beginning. The silence that followed that night was heavy, but different. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of survivors. The ranch, pockmarked with bullet holes and charred walls, breathed like an old warrior still standing. Jack paced the porch, feeling the weight of the rifle in his hands, but for the first time in years, he didn't carry it like a condemnation. Ellie, beside him, arranged the flowers in the living room vase, even with the broken windows. The gesture was simple, but it had the strength of someone who insists on remembering that life goes on. Despite the scars, the days returned at a slower pace, the sun rising golden over the dry earth. Jack mended fences, fixed roof tiles, and rebuilt what the fire had tried to steal. Ellie cooked, laughing shyly when the coffee was weak, and gradually filling every corner of the house with her presence. She was no longer just a fugitive. Now she was part of this home. The radio began to crackle again, playing old songs, and instead of fear, the two listened for company. Every small detail, a repaired chair, a pot on the stove, and exchanged. Smile was proof that they were forging a new destiny together. The nights, once marked by nightmares, began to bring rest. Ellie still woke sometimes, sweating, but she would find Jack sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting silently. He would hold her hand until the tremors subsided, and in that contact, she found peace. Jack, who had believed himself condemned to loneliness since his wife's death, now saw in Ellie an unexpected chance for redemption. It wasn't just a desire to protect. It was love emerging timidly, but so intense that not even the desert could dry it. One afternoon, as the sun set, tinting the sky red, Ellie slowly reached out and touched Jack's face. He closed his eyes, allowing that gesture to break down years of barriers. "You gave me something I thought I'd never have, a place to breathe without fear," she said, her voice breaking. Jack pulled her close, and for the first time, their lips met in a deep kiss, filled with pain, healing, and promise. It was a kiss that spoke not of beginnings, but of new beginnings. And they both knew in that moment that they were connected in a way that time would not erase. Despite the calm that was slowly returning, the scars of war remained. The ranch bore scars, just as they did. But each repair was also a symbol. The rebuilt roof, the fixed windows, the cleaned barn. Ellie brought color, Jack brought strength. And together, they brought hope. The network of power that still breathed outside didn't matter. Within that patch of land, they had overcome the Impossible. And that was enough to remind them that even the most broken hearts could blossom again. In their fireside chats, Ellie and Jack spoke little of the past. They preferred to discuss tomorrow, the plantation they could resume, the horse that still needed a shoe, the flowers she wanted to spread throughout the yard. Jack realized that the ranch, once a place of ghosts, was now a living space. And Ellie, who carried deep pain, found there not only refuge, but also the courage to dream. Love, previously unimaginable for both of them, flowed like water through dry stone. But the thought never left. Jack, gazing at the horizon, thought of the men who still held their grip on the valley. Ellie knew the fight wasn't over. However, they both learned something greater. Sometimes, what matters isn't defeating all your enemies, but choosing not to give up. The courage to face the past, to make room for love, was the true victory. With each new day, they discovered they weren't defined by their scars, but by how they chose to live despite them. The ranch had become a witness to this rebirth. Ellie's flowers in the window, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of Jack's broom on the porch. Everything was proof that even after fire and blood, there was room for tenderness. And in that simple routine, in the hands that silently sought each other, they found healing. Jack no longer saw himself as just a man scarred by loss. Now he was someone capable of loving again. And Ellie was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman who had chosen to fight, to love, and to begin again. And this is where the story finds you. How many times has life knocked on your door with the weight of the unexpected? How many times have you had the chance to open or close your heart? If it were you, would you open the door or let it pass? Think about this as you look around, because perhaps life is asking for courage right now. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share with someone who needs to hear that there's always a path to healing. Because in the end, every scar can hide a new beginning, and every open door can change a destiny. And here, at the heart of these stories, you never walk alone. And so, the ranch, scarred by bullets and fire, became a healing haven. Ellie was no longer just a survivor. Jack was no longer just a broken man. Together, they chose to start over. But I ask you, if life knocked on your door with a desperate request, would you have the courage to open it? Think about it, because maybe destiny is already calling right now. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear that there is always a new beginning. In the comments, tell me, do you believe that love has the power to heal even the deepest scars?